Good afternoon. Actually, it's not morning actually in my time zone, Dr. LaSalle. I guess maybe on the West Coast, we're still morning.
Yes. Not on the East Coast or well, you are the West Coast, just not the far West Coast.
Yeah, I'm Central Standard Time, dear.
I'll go ahead and get started just for the sake of time. And then just start with quick introductions. I am Tamika LaSalle. I'm professor at the University of Connecticut, and am presenting today with my counterpart, Dr. Graffenried, who is with Meadows Mental Health Policy Institute in Houston, Texas. And so we're going to talk about integrating school climate data within the PBIS framework to promote equitable educational experiences. I will say that for the first time, maybe ever, I posted the slides online, so they're already available. And so any questions that you have, you can defer to the slides in my emails at the end. Just a couple reminders about kind of expectations for engaging in the conference over the next couple days, being responsible, being respectful, and being safe. The chat will be open. We didn't create any polls, but the chat is open. Dr. Graffenried will be following the chat and kind of taking notes, and at the end we'll have time to answer questions. Hopefully this hasn't been an issue. You've been able to access your agenda in Pathable, and when you select sessions, then it'll allow you to join them at the start of each session. And then this is just some details for joining the session and how to interact through the chat, which you should be able to see already. Just a couple tips. Use the chat for engaging with other participants around the topic. And you can follow the overall expectations or please follow the overall expectations for using the chat. And like I said, we don't have polls, so that does not apply. Be careful about navigating away. If you do navigate, then you need to go back to your agenda and join the session. Social media, I forgot to say my social media handle. It's @TLaSalle for Twitter. It's pretty much all I use. If you want to tweet during the session. And Dr. Graffenried, do you want to give out your Twitter handle? Do you have one? You do.
I do. I don't remember it right now. Sorry. I'll come back. I'll get it. Sorry.
Okay. All right. And I just put mine in the chat. All right. And then lastly, as we're talking about this topic, school climate, I want you to consider these questions. How does this compare to your school priorities or your district priorities? How would you do this work? Throughout this presentation, I hope to talk about a few different resources that are easily accessible to everyone. Where would this work live? And so whose responsibility is it? Do you have a school climate group? Do you have a diversity group in your school? Do you have an equity group, a PBS group? Hopefully all of those are the same group, but think about where this is housed and what should we stop doing to make room for this work? And how will you assess whether or not the supports are being implemented? So I'll talk about school climate, give a little background in terms of like how far we've come with educational policy and school climate over the past several decades, and then talk about some practical integration and what that means within the current context of education and how we can use school climate data to consider equity and drive decision making. I have a bit of a sore throat, so forgive me if I stop for a second, but when we think about the current and really evolving context of education, I think it's really, really important to note that, our school population is primarily comprised of racially and ethnically minoritized students. I think 2014 was the first time that there was a shift in the total population, and we've continued to see that shift. 27% increase in the Latinx or Latin population over the past 12 or 14 years. And we've seen increases in other areas as well. And so what does that mean for us as educators? It means that we do have to have an increased foundational understanding of culture and the impact that it has on educational experiences, which I didn't include the definition of culture here, but I'll say to preface this, that when I'm referring to culture, I'm talking about any cultural identifier that students share and has an impact on their experiences. So race and ethnicity, disability status, gender identity, even geography, any unifying denominator that has an impact on student experiences. And so I don't always know what the cultural variables are within a school that I'm going into, right? Even in a school that is all white or all Black or comprised of all Latin students or Latinx students, there's still other cultural variables on top of that that have an impact on their outcomes. And so I just want to make that clear when I'm talking about culture moving forward, that I'm talking about all of these different variables. How do we integrate culturally affirming practices to promote student engagement and success? So really focusing on a strengths-based perspective and supporting students. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. And also being reflective about our own professional growth and our own effectiveness, and really critically examining the degree to which we contribute to or inhibit educational environments that meet the needs of students. So what are some of the basic assumptions of our educational system? One, that schools are microcosms of the greater society. But really, when we look at schools and we look at the diversity that exists within schools, that's not often replicated in what students see when they watch TV and the media and politics outside of their school oftentimes. And so for a lot of students, school is the most diverse setting for them. Or school is where a lot of the messaging happens. And so when we think about them as microcosms of the greater society, it's our first opportunity to talk to students and engage students and to create environments where they feel like their identities are affirmed and where they feel like they can get the skills that they need to be successful. Schools are structures to reproduce the norms of the dominant culture. And so, right, for a long time, we've talked about how do we create new norms within education, and how do we reconcile with the current context of education, because when we are reproducing white European middle class norms, that is just not reflective of the students that are in our classroom, and we have to recognize that. The historical structure and purpose of schooling contradicts current law and public policy. So when we think about traditional educational environments, they look completely different 20 years ago than they do today, 10 years ago than they do today. And so what is the purpose of schooling? How does that look different, right? The way that we engage with parents in school is different. The way that we engage with students is different, especially when I start to talk about public policy in a second and how it's literally evolved over time with respect to legislation. Also recognizing that knowledge of students' home and community is invaluable in interpreting classroom behavior and academic performance, right? To understand students, to understand their behavior, to understand how they respond to their environments, we have to understand them, and we have to understand the environments that they're coming from. They don't show up in schools, right? Contrary to popular belief, they don't show up as blank slates, right? They come from somewhere. They are impacted by things around them, and we have to be aware of that as educators. And also, I'll continue to say, we have to be aware of how things impact us also, and those interrelationships that exist as a result of that. And so what is school climate? So school climate is a concept that refers to the structural, interpersonal, and learning aspects of a school environment that are perceived by students, parents, and school personnel. Essentially, school climate is the way that a school feels. Right? So if you can access the chat, if you can just put in the chat, what are some of the ways when you walk into a school with a positive school climate, what are some of the things that you notice when you walk into schools with positive school climate? Just put some things in the chat. Because again, it's reflective of the norms and the goals and the values, interpersonal relationships, safety, organizational systems. And so when I walk into a school with a positive climate, I notice people saying hello, right? I notice that there are signs on the walls. I notice that students might be saying hello, right? There's this feeling, this light feeling when I walk into schools with a positive school climate that is palpable, and that you can definitely notice when you walk into a school when there's not a positive school climate. And so similarly, if you can put in the chat, what are some of the things that you notice when you walk into a school without a positive school climate? How does it feel? Or what do you notice?
Tamika, can you see the chat? You can't.
Oh no, can you?
Okay. Yes. So people were saying when they walk into a school that has positive school climate, they feel safe. People greet strangers. You're greeted by staff. Within a few seconds, you're welcomed.
Mm-hmm.
And then the opposite is it feels very cold and awkward, dark. Mm-hmm. You have an unwelcoming receptionist. Feels mm-hmm. cold. There are complaints. No eye contact, and people don't address one another. Mm-hmm. Limited personal interactions, limited mm-hmm. eye contact.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the one that resonates with me is the unwelcoming receptionist, right? You walk into a school and you're like, hi, and they're just looking down. And so again, like you can tell when I'm talking about school climate, like it is palpable. It feels like this thing that you notice, right? When you walk into a school with a positive versus a negative school climate. And though over time we've gotten better at measuring that, we still need to be able to describe what that feels like and how it impacts not just students, but also families and teachers. When I talk about school climate too, it's like this individual and a group phenomenon. And what I mean by that is individuals experience climate, right? Like, do I feel safe in this setting? Do I feel supported in this setting? Those are really important things. But it's also a group phenomenon because I'm looking at that at the individual level and I'm looking at it at the group level. And the common theme that I want, if we don't walk away with anything else, is how do we disaggregate data and use that to drive decision making? So from an individual perspective and a group perspective, I want to know, how do people feel about the school environment, right? Overall. And then how is it working for different students within different groups? Students with disabilities, racial, ethnic, minoritized students, students who are experiencing homelessness, and so on and so on. And so it's really important. It's also present in every school, right? School climate is just something that exists. And so it is something that we have to work at. Though it might be difficult to describe and measure, it is something that we know exists. In thinking about school climate and how to support settings that are responsive to the needs of students, the other common thread is thinking about how do we get out of this culture as a deficit model? How do we get out of this deficit-based thinking, right? So when students show up and they act in certain ways, we've often used deficit-based explanations that have focused on poor students and students of color to explain their behaviors, and thinking that we have to teach them how to be a good student. We have to teach them correct behaviors. And what that does is simultaneously send these signals to students that who they are or how they show up is not good enough, right? That's different from saying, these are the expectations outside of school, these are the expectations in school. How do we together come up with those norms? Versus saying, what you're doing is wrong. You can't speak that language here. You can't act like that, right? So thinking about how do we get out of that, I have to train them or I have to correct them, versus we're teaching students together how to be successful in this environment. And creating those norms should be shared. If not, it often leads to student disengagement. We'll talk about some other areas of school climate that it affects, and opposition, right? If it feels like you're sending me messages that who I am is not good enough or who my family is not good enough, then that's going to have an overarching impact. Advocates, seek to change student knowledge, language, culture, and behaviors in ways that are more consistent with mainstream norms, which is something that we're trying to get away from, right? One of my favorite quotes is, who defines the norm? And hence the deviation, right? Like, what does it mean when we say norm or typically developed typical student? It varies all the time. In terms of school policy, prior to ESSA, which is Every Student Succeeds Act, that was signed into law in 2015, December 2015, we focused on No Child Left Behind. I highlight ESSA because it's the first time, I think, that educational law is saying we have to look not just at the student, but we have to also look at the environment and the degree to which the environment is meeting the needs of students, right? And so if a student is struggling, it's not just like, well, you're struggling, we have to figure out how to fix the student, or we have to figure out how to do something different with the student. You also have to look at the environment, right? And so ESSA talks about using non-academic indicators to evaluate student outcomes. We're used to only relying on academic indicators, and ESSA has said that you can use a non-academic indicator. For some people, that's attendance. For other people, that's school climate. For me, it's school climate, obviously. And thinking about how then can I use that data to think about how the environment contributes to or inhibits students from being successful, right? And so again, this was signed into law in 2015, and there are several states that now use school climate as an outcome measure. But even at the state, it doesn't have to be at the state level. You can decide to do this at the school level, at the district level, because the data is something that can drive interventions at every level, interventions and supports at every level. And so again, this is kind of the educational landscape. And like I said, you'll see here, we talk about academic achievement and standardized testing, and all of these other measures, but then adding these non-academic measures as indicators of school success, part of the formula, similar to how we now look at progress towards goals, not just whether we made it or not. Think about school climate in that way also, right? Is there this perfect score? No. But it allows us to look at what are some of the things that we're doing really well and what are some of the areas of growth. The other piece is the accountability part. And what's really important for me is that if we're using measures to hold people accountable, it's important that the measures are valid. It's important that the measures have been have reliability, right? And so people started to use school climate measures, and it's varied in a number of different ways. If you go to the Safe and Supportive Schools website, I can put it in the chat, Safe and Supportive Schools website, they have a whole compendium of school climate surveys that have been validated. I'll talk about the one through the PBIS assessments today that I validated years ago with the state of Georgia. But there's so many different assessments. And I know that a lot of people have used different assessments. So how many people, you can put in the chat, use school climate data and use school climate assessments in their school? If you do, then just put it in the chat and let me know if you're using it at the school or the district level. But it's important that we use these valid and reliable means to support data collection. The other thing is these efforts should be parallel, not fragmented. So when I talked about earlier, well, where does this fit? If you have a school climate team and an equity team and a PBS team, I mean, instead of thinking about how we all act in silos, how is that one team, right? Because within PBS, school climate is encompassed in that, and using that data is an important part of that moving forward, or should be moving forward.
Dr. LaSalle, folks
Yes.
are saying yes, they use it at the district level. Some use it at the district and the school level.
Great. And so we'll talk about kind of what that looks like when we're analyzing data, but thank you. And so the other piece is when I first started talking about school climate within the context of PBS, I thought about where does this fit, right? My early conversations were with George Shagai around where this fits. And so when I think about school climate, I kind of have these three arms, right? So I'll start in the middle, archival data. This is the data that we're used to looking at. Suspensions and expulsions, we have to report that to the state, attendance and ODRs. So I call this archival data. This is our hard data. And we're used to looking at that data to see how our environment's working for students. The other piece of that is social validation data. That's the surveys. And so for me, perceptions are really important because perceptions are people's reality. Real or perceived, that's people's reality, students' reality, and it has an impact on how they perceive their environment, how they interact with their environment. And so that becomes really, really important. And so I think about different surveys. And so again, I'll take just 30 seconds. If you use the school climate survey, what's one of the surveys that you use? Just put it in the chat just so we can get an idea of the range that folks are using. So Dr. Graffreed, if you could just share that. you see some?
Waiting for them to come in.
Okay. While those are coming in, the other piece that comes hand in hand with that is observation data. And I'll talk about that a little bit today. It's one that we focus less on. But what we've been working on too is how do we use walkthrough assessments that mirror the school climate data? So what I want to know is for students who complete the surveys, right? They say, yes, there are adults in school that they can talk to. So how does that come up in my walkthrough? Then I say, can you name 3 adults in school that you can talk to, right? If students say that, they feel like they're often acknowledged for good behavior. Well, what are the ways that you're acknowledged? Can you name 3 ways that you're acknowledged? So the walkthrough assessment is a supplemental tool for me to say, okay, you're saying these things exist, but tell me what they look like. Tell me who they are. And I like that as a compliment because I'm able to see, I surveyed 20 students and they can only tell me 1 adult. And we want everybody to have 2 adults, right? So I do a preferred adult survey with students to make sure every student has an adult that they can connect with. And so again, it's that I call it this kind of checks and balances of data and using the survey data and using other forms of data collectively. Do you have some responses, Dr. Gregory?
No, I don't.
Okay, that's okay. I'll assume that you're all using the survey through PBIS assessments, which works out very well for me as we move forward. And so again, there are these different indicators and they worked, there's this triangulation of data. So it's really good to still have discipline data. But when I'm talking about school climate, that doesn't capture the experiences of students with internalizing behaviors. That doesn't capture the experiences of students who aren't showing up in the office. And if I'm trying to create an environment where everyone feels that they're a part of, then that's really, really important. This is another piece of it, is the mechanisms of change. And so what are the ways that I can influence change in my school, right? So when I'm thinking about student attitudes, how can I influence behaviors and outcomes and expectations? So are we being clear? Are we making sure that at tier 1, everyone knows what to expect? Are we being clear about the expectations? And even beyond that, are we creating expectations together? Right? What does it mean to be respectful? What does it mean to be kind? Especially since we know that racially and ethnically minoritized and marginalized students are disproportionately affected by those subjective behaviors, defiance, disrespect, and disruptiveness. And so in our climate survey, we ask, are the rules fair? Are they clear? Part of that is, how do we create these shared norms? Because students are more likely to be responsive to rules that they come up with together than rules that are just put on them, right? And this is our classroom, this is our school. So how do we do this together? Thinking about the setting and behaviors, do you notice different settings or different behaviors in different settings, right? When you're looking at your Swiss data, you're looking at the same thing. Do we see different behaviors during recess or during certain class periods? And how does that impact students? And then lastly, always thinking about outcomes and how our behaviors have an impact on student outcomes, and even how their own behaviors have an impact on their outcomes. And when I'm talking about outcomes, I focus on academic and social emotional, because we know that we cannot get to the academics. And this is something that, right, we've all known, I guess, as educators, but hasn't been super evident in the literature or in policy. But we know that we have to address the social, emotional, behavioral aspects of students before we can get into the academics, right? And so that's why we spend time at the beginning of school year getting to know students, using morning meeting, using advisory, using homeroom to get to know students and build relationships, because that is a central part of students' educational experience. When I think about school climate, I mean, what we know is that students with a positive perception of school climate often have higher student achievement, feel connected to school, have better relationships with teachers, and lower incidence of behavioral problems, right? And am I saying that it creates a perfect solution? No, because it's going to vary, right, from school year to school year, depending on your students. It's I kind of call it the cohort effect, right? These 6th grade students need something different than these 6th grade students. We're all at a time where students have been out of school from anywhere from 6 months to a year and a half, right? They literally have not had the opportunity to learn a lot of social skills. If they get frustrated with somebody, they just black out their screen or log off. And now you're in person and you don't have the opportunity to do that. The same for adults. And so students are showing up even more so now, not really sure about how to like connect with someone interpersonally, not to handle frustration, or they don't know how to handle frustration. They're overwhelmed with all of the stimuli because they're used to being able to withdraw or to be getting that in doses. And so now even more, probably more than ever, climate is really important because I like to use the data to be able to say, where are the strengths and how do we use that to bolster the areas that students need support, right? And how do we continue to look at that data iteratively as we're making that decision? Two of the areas that I think are important, there are three I'll talk about right in a minute, but school connectedness and peer and adult relationships. So when I'm talking about culture, back to how I defined it earlier, you have to be thinking about whether cultural mismatches between students and teachers are associated with poor establishment and maintenance of student-adult relationships. And so what I mean is, have we put in an intentional effort to build relationships with students? I used to always say relationships are naturally recurring. People form relationships, and I learned over the years that yes, they're naturally recurring, but they're not necessarily positive and naturally occurring, right? And so I have to be intentional about the relationships that I form with students, because I could think we have a great joking relationship and the student could be feeling tortured every day that they're in your classroom because it's not who they are and it's not how they express themselves. And so I have to be aware of, how I build relationships with different students and be intentional about that. The other piece is, when we think about students' feelings of acceptance and belonging, all students want to feel accepted and feel like they belong by their teachers, right? Even the ones who feel like they give us the roughest time, they show up. They have like perfect attendance because there's something about school, right, that appeals to students. And so they all want to feel that they're accepted and that they belong. But we do have to be thinking about what does that look like for students? I was reading recently, and what we've seen is in most schools or across the country, you see increasing rates of primarily minoritized schools or primarily white schools. So 60 to 70% of Black and brown students are in schools where they have a population of 60 to 70% of Black and brown schools, and conversely the same for white students. The asterisk to that is, even in schools where there's a 60 to 70% minoritized population, there's still, right, a majority white teaching force. Does it mean that we can't connect with students? Absolutely not. Does it mean that we have to be thinking about what are some of the various ways that we do connect with them? Yes. For white teachers, for middle-class teachers, for teachers from different settings. It's incumbent upon all of us as educators to be thinking about, how do I connect with students? I'm not automatically going to connect with you just because we look the same or just because I'm your teacher. I have to be intentional about that. And in being intentional about that, I have to be thinking about, what are the ways that I affirm your identity, right? What are the ways that I make sure that as a student, you feel like you belong here the way that you are, right? And so my additive impact is not to change you, but to help you to be successful in this environment and to help you to flourish. That's very different, right? This strengths-based perspective versus this deficit perspective of, I have to teach, I have to change you, I have to fix you. Speaking of, when we talk about cultural acceptance, that is the degree to which students feel respected, regardless of their academic ability, the racial and ethnic background, religion, etc. And so we talk about how are cultural variables and markers perceived or incorporated into everyday educational process. And when I talk about, cultural acceptance for students, that can mean a number of different things: language, cultural norms. Why does it bother people when students speak Spanish during non-class time or to each other? Should that be part of the norm, or is it like, you can't do that here? And so what is the messaging that we're sending to students about who they are? And if we take a few days or minutes to look into the school climate surveys, we don't have to guess, we can get that data, because students are usually willing to tell us how they feel if we ask them. But if we ask, then we have to be prepared to do something about it and to follow up also. I kind of have this like pseudo timeline across like the school year of what this might look like. So generally, when I talk about collecting school climate data, I recommend collecting data at least after the first 45 days of school, so that students have time to get adjusted and the data can be reflective of their experience so far. So let's say in September or October, you administer and review the data. Then you're using that to set goals. And when you're doing that, you're looking at it at the overall level, but again, you're looking at it at subgroups. So I want to know, overall, do students feel safe in school? Overall, do they feel connected in school? But then in figuring out what are our strengths and weaknesses and what strategies do we recommend? I mean, I think right now we're all in the process of like shifting our triangle, right? Because so many more students need social emotional supports. And so it's not necessarily only students who need tier 2 services. Now we're thinking about how do we add that into morning meeting? How do we add that into advisory? How do we talk about coping skills and interpersonal skills with students more broadly? Because once we get to 40, 50, 60% of students that need those skills, right, it's not necessarily something that's a tier 2 support, it's something that all students need. So how do you review your data strategically? And it's important to build this into your process, right? Like not to do this flippantly, but to build it into your process so that it's normalized and that you carve out time to do it and to be intentional about it. I talked about the walkthrough tools. I can share those later, but and it's not something that everyone has to use. But like I said, I've used it more and more to be able to have this checks and balances between what students report and what I can actually get from them in terms of which adults are you going to in the school? What rules do you recall? What supports are helpful for you? So I'm able to get that kind of information so I can be specific about the supports. And then in general, we'd administer the survey within the last 45 days of school. So we can look at progress over time. And I'll talk through the surveys in a second, but we want to look at progress over time. So like I said, there are a number of surveys that are out there. Delaware School Climate Survey, California Healthy Kids Survey. There's so many different surveys that are available. And if you go to Safe and Supportive Schools, then there's a whole compendium. Through PBIS assessment, we also have the Georgia School Climate Suite. And that survey includes parent, personnel, student, and family surveys, or parent and family, student, and personnel surveys. Couple important things. The surveys are free, okay? And I think that that's really important, especially I think if we're holding schools accountable, we should give them reliable and free access to tools. So it's free. PBIS assessment to take the survey is free also, okay? And so you can set your school up to take the survey and be fully implementing, be just implementing, be not implementing very well, be struggling to implement, and still be able to get this data, which I think is really, really important. Like I said, the surveys are free, the Georgia School Climate Surveys. You could always email me to get them. You can Google me, not Google me, that sounded really arrogant. Google the surveys to be able to access the surveys. They're freely available. You can put them in a SurveyMonkey if you wanted to, but the data is what's really important. And so I'll walk through the surveys just generally. There's a brief school climate survey that is at the secondary level, that's 6 through 12. And over the last few years, we've implemented a more comprehensive one that's 36 items to be able to look at subscales. Then there's an elementary, a personnel, and a parent survey. Okay. And there's overlap across all the different questions. The purpose is to be able to do some degree of triangulation also, right? To collect data and say, well, how do students feel about the school? How do teachers feel about the school? Because it's really important to be looking at those interrelationships. And so I strongly encourage schools to collect data from all the stakeholders to be able to create environments where everyone feels successful. And so this is just a brief review of the surveys. Okay. And again, I always think about like, what kind of questions can I answer with this data, right? So how do I combine the school climate data with these other indicators that you're already used to getting, that you're already used to gathering, the indicators like discipline and things like that. So I can look at suspensions and expulsion and how that has an impact on teacher expulsion or teacher perceptions, right? Do teachers feel safe in schools? Do they feel supported? If not, then what do I do? Or maybe it's certain grade levels or certain teachers. Maybe it's the specials or connections teachers, and they're struggling with students more so than classroom teachers. So how do we implement, or how do we go back and reteach expectations? How do we think about what supports others might need? When you think about ODRs, majors versus minors, that goes back to even student level perceptions, right? Part of the questions are, do you feel like the rules are fair? Is there an adult in school that you can talk to? Do you feel connected to school? So if I notice that certain groups are having certain experiences, I can go back and check, what does the data look like for that group? Far too often we rely on overall data only, right? And we say overall, everybody loves the school and school climate is great. And overall, the score is 3.8 on a 4-point scale. That's great, but we know that if you disaggregate the data, then it can tell a different story, right? Students who identify as LGBTQ+ could have a 2.7 overall because they don't feel safe, because they don't feel connected. Students with disabilities, racial and ethnically minoritized students. So it's important to look at the data and to disaggregate it, because we don't do it often enough. And through PBIS assessments, or through many methods these available today, the data will present itself for you. Once you collect it, it will break it down for you. So it's not a manual process that you have to do yourself. You can see it from the tables and be able to go back and ask yourself questions like, if there are significantly more discipline referrals in 7th grade compared to other grades, then let me go back to the data for 7th grade and look at their ODRs, their suspensions, their achievement, and also their school climate, and see what are the positives about school and what are the areas that they're struggling in. I would also do that with 7th grade teachers, right? Where are their strengths and where are they struggling, to be able to answer some of those questions. Boys are suspended at a much higher rate than girls. Well, what are they being suspended for? What are their perceptions about being connected? Do they feel like there's an adult in school that they can talk to, right? Are peer relations, are they struggling with peer relations because of fights or because of interpersonal relationships? So being able to answer those kind of questions. Absentee rates for certain groups are disproportionate. Why aren't these students coming to school? You know, what are their perceptions of the school environment? And so there are things that we can always do at the school level, but then there are also things that we can be intentional about in supporting students that are targeted, because we're all trying to preserve resources here, right? And so we might not need to find, have a mentoring program for every student in the school. But if I recognize for 7th graders, they need a mentor, then I can use our resources to help them find a mentor. Maybe 6th and 8th grade, they don't need it. What's going on there is working. And so you can think about, how can we be more selective but targeted in how we dispel resources? And I think that that's really key. If I were looking at this data, hopefully you can see it, but let's say I'm looking at this data, and this is the Georgia School Climate Survey, right? Just look at this part over to the left. And if I was looking at the national average and I said, okay, the national average is 3.12 on a 4-point scale, right? The study average, which is like the district average, is 3.14. So in our district, in Rochelle district, on average, students have 3.1 score of school climate, pretty good, right? Our school, the perception is 2.8, right? And so then I wonder, okay, why is it lower? What areas is it lower in? Because relative to not just the national average, because it's good to look at national norms, but it's really, really good to look at local norms also, right? Because if it's low across the district, then I can think about, well, what are the supports that the district needs? For the school, I might say, okay, well, how do I look further into this? On the right, I put a couple of examples of other data that you might look at. Okay, well, superstars or whatever, whatever you use, tickets or whatever, how many stars are awarded for positive behavior? How many stars are awarded in other schools? And what does that look like? 27, that's good. How many office discipline referrals do we have? 53, right? And so we start to look at all the data together. Yes, stars are being awarded for good behavior, but there are also a lot of discipline referrals. And so who are receiving those referrals? And how do we go back to our data, that 2.88, and look at who that 2.88 represents, right? You're always going to have students who feel exceedingly excited about the school, right? And then you have those that hate coming to school. So the average, right, tells part of the story, but it doesn't tell all the story. And I want to balance that out with things like superstars, things like office discipline referrals, and be able to be targeted in how I support students. I won't describe the triangle because we all know the triangle oh so well. And the key takeaway here is if I notice that overall across the school, students rate safety low, then I can think about at the school level, what does that mean? I can increase adult monitoring in the hallway, right? We can make sure that they don't have open bathroom time and they have to go to the bathroom during certain times or certain grade levels or something like that. But there are certain things that I can do at the school level that can support students. And then if I notice that there are trends across fourth grade, then I can then focus on building student-teacher relationships, right? Creating mini groups, creating pods, creating, dare I say it, lunch bunches to support students, right? Because fourth grade is struggling, and I might see that paired with discipline data. I might see that paired with even minors, right? It's not always about like suspensions and expulsions. It could be a lot of minor behaviors that are just really aggravating. And so like, how do we address that for students? And then if I see increasing level of supports for students with IEPs, then we think about, okay, how do we support them above and beyond? And we all know just because they're getting upper level services doesn't mean we stop the services below, right? We still want to maintain adults in the hallway because people don't feel safe. We still want to maintain the bathroom rules while we're also finding mentors for fourth grade boys. I can't see my mouse. Oh, there we go. And so the other thing is, thinking about, again, who does the data represent? Does it represent most people in the school? Do teachers love it and students hate it? Conversely, do teachers or students love it and teachers hate it? Right? You want to make sure it's representative. I don't find that to generally be a problem with students and teachers, but sometimes with the parent survey, if you only get 20% back or 17% back, you have to ask yourself, well, who's filling out the survey, right? Is it like a Yelp review where it's people who really, really love the school and people who despise it? Or is it just the PTA parents? And you want to think about how to make it representative so that you know the story that you're telling. And so trying to be intentional. Again, generally not an issue at the teacher or student level because it's administered in school, but sometimes it comes up with the parent surveys. Just going to show you an example of how do we share the data, right? And use this data sheet that I've kind of developed, but it mirrors PBIS assessment. How do we use these sheets to reveal patterns at different levels and have a graphic representation? Because sometimes the overwhelming part of data is all the numbers, right? And trying to figure out, well, what numbers are helpful, who do we need to show it to, and how do we use that? And so here is an example of how we're able to look at the data and be able to say, okay, how many students are in the school? How many across each grade level? This is just the demographics. Who are we assessing? And we even added at the bottom, you can put your TFI score there too, right? So when you're looking at your data, you can add TFI data to be able to say, again, everything is within context, right? So within this context where tier 1 is really solid and we're looking at overall school data, then that makes sense, right? But if your TFI tier 1 score is relatively low, and your school climate score is low, it's probably not that much of a surprise, but it can still give you an idea of where to improve. The other piece is looking at being able to look at demographic data, and then being able to look at scores across different students. So here's an example of where I can put their average rating, but I can also put for that group ODRs, suspensions, and absences. So it's being able to have all that data in one spot. And for the extended survey, you can have the school climate rating and the subscales. But being able to look at that. So if I look across and I see boys, 2.0 on a 4-point scale, increased number of ODRs, increased number of suspensions, increased number of absences, then I'm going to hone in on that group. Similarly, because strengths-based perspective is really important, we're going to look at, well, where are the areas that things are going really well? How do we replicate those efforts? Right? And think about what groups or what areas are students saying, I feel really good about the school, right? Everybody has an adult, that's great. Peer relations are really struggling. So what are we going to do about that? right? Everyone feels safe in school, but they don't feel connected to an adult. What are we going to do about that? And so you're thinking about strengths that you want to bolster and also areas of improvement. And then this is just another way to be able to show the data in a way that I think is easily digestible and easy to share with teachers and parents. Okay. A couple other examples of just being able to look at subgroups across schools. The questions, the survey, the secondary asks about disability status, the primary does not. They all ask about race and ethnicity. And in general, we've added this question about like what other culture groups, because right, white, Latin or Latinx, Black, that only tells me this much of the story, right? If I have a large Latino or Latinx population, but it's Puerto Rican and Honduran and Colombian, like I want to know so that I can think about the supports for students, right? And so in a lot of places now we're struggling with, how do I disaggregate the white data, the Black data, Latinx data? Because if I want to be targeted, then these four groups don't tell the whole story in these really in our increasingly diverse schools. And so we asked this question about like what other cultural group, so that we can get more data around that. So this is my personal struggle right now, is like how do we extend beyond these overall groups to be able to disaggregate in the way that does the data justice. The last thing I'll say before passing the mic is systems of change, they take time, right? But now is the time. We can't wait. Our schools are becoming increasingly diverse in so many different ways, right? When I'm talking about culture, talking about gender identity, and talking about students with disabilities, and talking about students with mental health problems, and talking about race and ethnicity. And so now is the time. Also, you don't have to be a person of color or a person who is minoritized or marginalized to initiate change, right? We talked a lot, I'm sure you've heard the national dialogue around being an ally, being an accomplice, that applies across a number of different areas. And so think about, how are we reflective of our own practices and our own skills and what we bring to the table? And what am I doing to advocate for students? What am I doing to move them forward and not just kind of being complacent? Change must happen at the systems level and then trickle down if they're going to be maintained. So use your triangle, use your framework. Sometimes we can be really reactive, right? And we think, okay, I got to support this student, I got to support this student. But if I start noticing that I often have to support Black boys because of quote unquote disrespect, then instead of supporting individuals, how do I start to be reflective about what is it that they need? Or even more importantly, what is it that we need as educators to better support the students? Because if we have this myopic perspective, then we think about it as every student addressing that versus thinking about the patterns across students and how we can use that information. Self-awareness, lastly, self-awareness and self-reflection should be standards of practice in education, right? We have to be reflective about what we're doing and again, how we're contributing to or inhibiting positive educational experiences for students. And so use your professional development groups, use your professional cohorts to be reflective about the processes at the individual and at the school level and thinking about what you can do to drive change. Okay. I'll stop there and pass it to my colleague so that she can make some additional comments. So let me stop sharing. There you go.
As always, Dr. LaSalle, you drop a lot of knowledge on us that increase our background as professionals, but things that we can do to take information that we can take back and share with our LEAs. As you were talking about school climate, I'm just going to veer off a little bit, and I am going to probably show my age because it makes me think about, when I think about school climate, it makes me think about the sitcom Cheers. Do you remember that? And you remember the theme song, and it says, sometimes you just want to go where everybody knows your name and they're always glad you came. You want to be where you can see our troubles are all the same. You want to be where everybody knows your name. It's powerful, that theme song, as it relates to school climate and feeling connected where people know your name and they're glad that you came to school. And so I think as a practitioner, the things that we're seeing nowadays in this COVID environment are concerns about children's mental health. as it relates to COVID and being out of, all the things that children have had to deal with in the last 18 to 24 months. I think about schools are struggling with, a lot of schools in our state have gotten their letters from our DOE saying you're significantly disproportionate. Now you've got to act. And I think school climate plays a role in that. I don't think that we do a good job. And I love the way that you talked about data in terms of archival data and observational data, but also the social validation data. And sometimes we are remiss and we're not incorporating that process data into our assessment of the situation. And we certainly don't do a very good job of using that social validation data to drive our decision making. So I think about one of my areas of interest and expertise would be looking at root cause analysis and trying to figure out what is the what's causing things such as significant disproportionality as it relates to our kids in SPED with out of school suspensions and in-school suspensions. The other thing that I thought about is that this data is not just good for our kids. I love that we have these surveys that can help us understand where our teachers are. So many times, and I'm sure a lot of folks are dealing with schools, trying to support schools where there's a shortage of staff. And we're assuming that we understand what's going on, but there's nothing like getting data and seeing where our staff members are so that we can support them and meet them where they are. I read an article recently that said staff is like, we need assistance, but we don't want any more yoga. We don't want any more, it said like cake in a jar. We need time. We need time to call parents. We need time to do our work. I think if we got some good data on where our staff are, then we can absolutely meet them where they are. One of the things I want to share with our audience today, Dr. LaSalle and I met yesterday, and I love the way she talked about the triangle, and sometimes you're going to have to adjust the triangle down. So we were talking about how many of us have used things like check in, check out. We understand that we need to connect children and make sure that there's someone who they feel connected with as we go about addressing their behavioral needs. But what if you have a whole lot of kids at tier 1 who need that? Then maybe check in, check out is no longer a tier 2 intervention. Maybe we bring it down and it's something that we do for all kids, but we wouldn't know that unless we collected that data to find that kids are feeling disconnected, that they don't have someone to go to. So I think it's really about shifting what we already know, but applying it in this domain so that a intervention that we used to use at tier 2, if we're seeing that 80% of kids are feeling disconnected, maybe that now needs to become a universal intervention. And so those are some strong points that I thought were so important in terms of making sure that kids feel connected. The other thing that I want to share as a personal thing I experienced recently, as a mother, there was a school shooting that was about 3 miles from my child's school. It wasn't his school. And I have a girlfriend who, I don't know if she's on here, but she said, it's scary when you're a school psychologist because you know things. And I had to ask my son, do you feel safe? Do you feel safe at school? And I didn't want to ask because I didn't want to hear the answer that maybe he doesn't feel safe. And if he doesn't feel safe, then what about the other children on the campus? I'm even concerned about what about the other adults on the campus? This wasn't even the school that the incident occurred, but certainly it has to impact the children at surrounding schools. And so as school districts are confronted with things like violence on campuses, prior to going and implementing interventions, we really get a good sense of where our stakeholders are, being our parents, our students, and our teachers, and using that data to really drive our decision making. So those are some highlights. I do want to, again, say the importance of disaggregating that data. And Dr. LaSalle, you last talked about if we have a group of Black boys, and we now need to look at that particular group. We want to look at that particular group and disaggregate the data, but we want to approach it from a strengths-based approach versus deficit ideology. So when we disaggregate, yes, it's important to disaggregate, but it's important to make sure that we look at it from, again, strengths-based versus what's wrong with these kids, and shifting that to how can we support these kids. So I loved how you talked about how we can support children and supporting different subpops.
I just want to add something, to that real quick. One of the questions we asked early on is we have to also be thinking about, like, what are we replacing when we're to get this data or to be able to incorporate this, right? Especially at a time where everyone feels overwhelmed already. And so part of it is thinking about what is it that we're replacing to be able to gain time to collect this data and to look at this data. Because if you're going to collect it and not use it, you might as well not collect it, right? Because students and teachers, like, they're giving their time, they're answering these questions. If they never hear anything about it, then it makes them feel like, well, it's not going to be important. And so it really is important to be thinking about, how do you carve out time and be intentional about collecting this data and use it to move forward? And I think that it's especially important because you're getting data that you can use, right? And getting data that can help you say, okay, where do we intervene? And it's data that you can collect over time, so you can also be able to see how is that changing the environment for students, right? And being able to follow up. A lot of times, we do things and we don't really know the outcome, but we're able to follow up, whether you use a brief survey or the extended survey. I think that it's really important. And so I just want to add to that, at a time where I know everybody is overwhelmed, think about how you can use this data intentionally, especially within the current context, to think about who needs what, when.
And, on that point, I think about staff, how we can tier out our staff in terms of the needs that they have and be responsive to them as well. Absolutely. Do we want to open up for questions?
Yes, of course.
So I think we'd like to encourage you guys to put questions in the chat, and I will relate those questions to Dr. LaSalle. And while we're waiting for the chat to come, I want to share with the audience, and if you came in a little bit after the beginning, I just wanted to, I am originally from Houston, Texas, and the World Series starts tonight. And so as you can see how I've named myself, Dr. Clenny, to Go Astros, Graph and Read. I just had to get that out there. Yay for the Astros, who will be the next World Series champs. Hope that doesn't cause any problems out there. Please put your questions in the chat.
Also, I'll put in the chat, someone had added the school climate compendium. Thank you, I added that. And then I added a link to PBIS apps with the school climate data for you to be able to, anyone to be able to look at.
People are just processing all this good information, Dr. LaSalle.
Yeah, I mean, I guess any questions about how using data, administering the surveys, how to increase participation.
You know what, Dr. LaSalle, one question I had that some people might be struggling with, what if you have a campus that is not doing PBIS? And you mentioned that earlier, but can you say that again, that they can still use these school climate surveys, even if they don't have PBIS to full implementation, correct?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think through PBIS apps, anyone can access that site and collect the data through that site. Like I said, the surveys are available through the web. So you can find the surveys and even implement them yourself, or put them in the system yourself. What I like about PBIS apps is that when you collect the data, you get the tables and you get the output that you need, right? And so it cuts down on the time of having to do it yourself. And the surveys have been validated. Those other ones through the Safe Supported Schools have been also. So using surveys that have been validated. I know that a lot of times school districts have created their own surveys or developed their own questions. And, I like doing factor analysis and validating surveys. And so I think that if you do that, it's just important, because what you want to make sure of is that you're asking questions and the constructs that you're assessing do hold up, right, across students, what we call measurement variance, and that you're actually measuring what you want to measure, so that when you go to evaluate the response or the change, then you're able to do that with confidence. I can't see the chat, so I can't tell. Are there no questions?
No, at this point, Trish, do you see any questions? Oh, someone just raised their hand. It's 2 people. If you have your hand raised, will you please put your question in the chat?
Yes, please do, because we can't call on you.
Yeah. So far, no questions have come in.
Yeah, I don't, like I said, I see the hand raised. I will put my email in the chat, and Dr. Affirming, do you want to put yours also? I put my email in the chat in case you have questions after this, and you can definitely follow up if you haven't put anything in the chat. Like I said, the presentation is already posted online, and so there's some information there, but happy to answer any questions that you have beyond that. So I think we'll stop there. And again, I just want to say thank you to everyone for attending. And, I hope that this is helpful and that you walk away from this being able to feel like collecting this data is not only useful, but feasible, and being able to look at it and drive the decision making, or look at how the interventions or supports that you're already implementing are having an impact on students. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Trisha, do you want us to stay, or do we need to stay? I will hang around in case there are questions that come in.
Oh, thank goodness. Can you hear me now?
Oh, yeah.
I sent you guys emails. I lost, I could
It's
hear
still
you.
recording.
Oh, yep. Hold on really quick. It'll trim too. Hold on. Taskmaster. Ladies, I have to leave and stop the Zoom because we're having technical difficulties and the help desk is telling me to leave and refresh my Zoom.
Okay.
I just got an email saying the chat was disabled.
So
It's still recording, but I think she's gonna come right back.
yep.
You got an email?